let's jump right into it with both feet, Robert. I've introduced this term Sharia. It's one that I think most of our audience is familiar with because we talk about it a lot with you and others. But help us understand, given your deep mastery of the Quran, the traditions of Islam, the authoritative institutions, academic centers, and so on. Help us understand what they all believe Sharia to be and why it's so important that we understand it properly.
Well, Frank, the short answer is that Sharia is, for a pious Muslim, the law of God. And it is, as such, unalterable, immutable, unquestionable, to be implemented, not to be questioned. And why it should concern us is because it is a comprehensive program for every aspect of human life, the most minute details of individual behavior, as well as, but not solely consisting of, ritual activities for the Islamic religion, but also covering all sorts of other things, a full range, really, the full range of human activities, and also behavior of states, behavior of nations, behavior of one group toward another, so that Sharia is a comprehensive system of for political arrangement of societies and the relationship of societies to other societies that quite explicitly and unapologetically considers itself to apply to non-Muslims as well as to Muslims. And Muslims are told that they have a duty before God to extend the rule of Sharia law to non-Muslims. And this is something of grave concern for all of us because Sharia mandates that non-Muslims, in view of their rejection of Muhammad and his prophetic status, ought to be relegated to a second-class position in society and deprived of numerous rights, such that they do not enjoy the same equality of rights with Muslims, but are oppressed and discriminated against in numerous ways. And
Robert, let me interrupt you just to say that we're talking with Robert Spencer of Jihadwach.org. You've described, I just want to come back to it, you've described a program that, quite apart from, relegating the non-believers, the infidels, the kufirs, as they say, to very much second-class status, dimitude, it requires a global theocracy, the rule of, as you said, Sharia worldwide, which by definition means displacing our own constitutional form of government. Is that right?
Yes, that's quite right. And so it's at variance with and contradiction to our constitutional form of government in numerous ways, including putting restrictions upon the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience, the equality of rights of women with men, and the equality of rights of non-Muslims with Muslims. And in those ways, it's in complete contradiction to the United States Constitution, and it is avowedly a competitor to that Constitution. A believing, pious, informed Muslim considers that it will be his responsibility to replace governments that are constituted according to ways like our Constitution, but not limited to it. This is a worldwide thing. And so any government that is not constituted according to Sharia will be considered an enemy by a pious, believing Muslim, and he will consider it part of his religious responsibility to fight against such a government in order ultimately to replace it with Sharia. It's up to Muslims to decide what's true Islam and what isn't. But there's no denying and there's no doubt that the appeal that the Sharia supremacists have among Muslims is that they do present themselves as being the exponents of authentic Islam, and they are able to quote Quran and quote Islamic law and quote the Sunnah, the practices of Muhammad, in order to justify this view. And the peaceful Muslims who reject Sharia, who undeniably exist, as you have pointed out, do not have any coherent or traditional or authoritative version of Islam that they can point to or do point to in order to justify their rejection of Sharia imperatives. They have been influenced by Western notions of human rights, and that's all to the good, and they deserve our wholehearted support in that rejection of the elements of Sharia that are at variance with Western notions of human rights. But we shouldn't have any illusions about there having any kind of authoritative or traditional justification within Islamic teaching or law.
Yeah, and that really is the rub, that they are unquestionably in a struggle with those who adhere to Sharia. I'm afraid condemned to a disadvantaged position. As you say, it's not for us to judge which is right, but I think there's unquestionably a problem here where we pretend, at our considerable peril, that those who are Sharia adherent are somehow extremists, radicals, fundamentalists, hijacking the religion and the like, when, as you've pointed out and as you've written so brilliantly about in so many different places, Robert Spencer, those who adhere to Sharia have the authoritative text and traditions and practices and so on going for them. About jihad, the program that Sharia demands of its adherents by way of a struggle against the infidels, against the unbelievers, against all who stand in the way of the triumph of Islam. And I thought it might be interesting to just hear a clip of the worldview of one of those who espouses jihad and Sharia, a chap by the name of Imam Anwar al-Awlaki.
So on the political level, the world is united in fighting Islam. There is no exception on the political level. Every single government in the world is in line to fight Islam. Every government, without exception.
So, Robert Spencer, how characteristic would you say that is of the worldview of those who are Sharia adherents and pursuing jihad? And tell us why such sentiments are manifesting themselves in a lot of different kinds of jihadist activities.
Well, Islamic jihadists pretty much universally claim that the West is at war with Islam and that the West hates Islam and so on, despite the best efforts of George Bush and now Barack Obama to avoid giving that impression. And they do this ultimately because of a theological imperative within Islamic law. Jihad is warfare against unbelievers. It is carried out in many ways, though it's not necessarily hot warfare. It can also be warfare of the pen or of the tongue or of the pocketbook, warfare against unbelievers in any number of forms. But above all, it is defensive because in Islamic law, only the caliph, who is the unified leader of all Muslims, has the authority to declare offensive warfare against unbelievers. But if an Islamic land is attacked, then jihad, warfare against unbelievers, becomes an individual obligation upon every Muslim, whether or not there is a caliph declaring jihad or not. And, of course, there is no caliph, has not been, since the abolition of the caliphate by the Turkish government in 1924. And subsequent to that, Islamic jihadists have had to cast every one of their activities as a defensive struggle, a defensive jihad. And so in this case, we hear al-Awlaki saying that the world is at war with Islam because this justifies his actions against the non-Muslims and justifies really any action of Islamic jihadists against non-Muslims because it's all defensive.
Let's just drill down for a minute on this point. Violent jihad, a term you've coined, I think, stealthy jihad, jihad of the pocketbook, the financial jihad, supporting either the violent or this more stealthy type. These are all, in other words, obligations of the faithful Muslim, according to Sharia, as long as the al-Awlakis of the world or others are able, in the absence of a caliph, to say, we are fighting a defensive war. You must engage in this. This is not a personal internal struggle, as we're often told. This is, in fact, warfare to bring about the triumph of Sharia. Is that right?
Very much so, Frank. And it is it's a hot war, but not only a hot war, as you pointed out, that the stealthy means of extending the rule of Sharia over the West, over non-Muslims, are all employed, but it's all cast as a defensive struggle and justified by the alleged non-Muslim incursion into Islamic lands. And so even when the United States, with all good intentions, and intentions indeed to protect Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein, went in with troops into Saudi Arabia in the first Gulf War in the early 90s. That was considered by Osama bin Laden and other hardliners to be on offense and something that called for defensive jihad because the non-Muslim soldiers were trampling down the sacred soil of the Kingdom of the Two Holy Places.
Right. Robert Spencer, I mentioned this Imam Anwar al-Awlaki with some purpose in mind. This is, of course, an imam at a very radical mosque in Northern Virginia that had been attended for a time by Major Nidal Malik Hassan, the alleged perpetrator of the massacre at Fort Hood. I was struck, as seems to be the case, after every one of these violent incidents, of the FBI saying there's no evidence of terrorism involved in these attacks. Help us understand, Robert Spencer, the connection between these individuals or the perpetrators of these attacks that gainsays basically this argument that the FBI seems to be making that, well, unless we see some sort of central command structure that is directing from caves in Afghanistan or someplace else that these fellows engage in violent jihad, it doesn't qualify as terrorism, let alone as an act of terrorism in the name of advancing Sharia. Is there something else going on here?
Yeah, this is because the government and law enforcement establishments have been completely blindsided by this whole threat, and they don't really know how to deal with it. And above all, they've been completely oblivious, by accident as well as by design, by political correct design. They've been completely oblivious to the ideology that fuels the Islamic Jihad. They tend to think of this threat solely as a matter of isolated groups that are carrying out various terrorist actions. And so if somebody like Nidal Hassan is not a member of one of those isolated groups, then they consider that he must not have anything to do with what they consider to be the terrorist threat. What they don't recognize, and apparently will not, refuse to recognize, is that the Islamic Jihad is being carried out by many means other than terrorism, and that the same goal that the Islamic terrorists have, which is to bring Sharia to the West, is being pursued by other Islamic groups and individuals in ways that have nothing to do with terrorism, or that they are being carried out by Muslims who are radicalized, as the term has it, by the Quran itself, or by the teachings of Muhammad and the traditional teachings of Islam, and they have no organizational connection to Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group, but because they read what they read in the Quran, which does teach violence against unbelievers, they consider that it is part of their religious responsibility to wage that war against unbelievers, and so some of them turn into people like Nidal Malik Hassan.
There are reports that the Saudis have gone to great lengths to recruit members of the United States military into their program. There are certainly instances like that of Nidal Malik Hassan, members of the armed forces who have a Muslim background before they join the military. There are some who are apparently being converted to Islam by clerics that have been selected by Wahhabis or others who adhere to Sharia. Tell us about the problem as you see it in that sort of microcosmic case of the military of the United States.
Well, Frank, Now the military is pretty close-mouthed about this issue because they've been stung. But up until a few years ago, at least, the only two groups that were authorized to vet chaplains, Muslim chaplains for the U.S. military, were both under investigation for connections to terrorist groups. And they were both indeed Muslim Brotherhood organizations. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, something that I know that you want to discuss, that is an international Islamic organization dedicated to imposing Sharia around the world by whatever means necessary and possible. And so it's really kind of ironic. It would be as if some German organization that was connected to the Nazis was given relatively free rein to operate in the United States during World War II.
Yeah, well, since you brought it up, let's talk about the Brotherhood, because its mission, as we understand it, is absolutely seditious. How would you characterize the purpose of the Muslim Brotherhood here in the United States, Robert Spencer?
Well, I'll use their own words. There was a document, an internal meeting of the Brotherhood that was mapping out its strategy for the United States. And that document was captured by investigators when they went into the Holy Land Foundation, which up until a few years ago was the largest Islamic charity in the United States, but has since been shut down because of its funneling money to Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, the jihad terror group in Israel. And the document that was captured at that time that the Holy Land Foundation was shut down detailed the Muslim Brotherhood strategy in the United States. And it said it very clearly that the brothers in the United States, it said, and I quote, must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that it is eliminated and Allah's religion is victorious over other religions. So this is a frankly and openly seditious organization that is working through its various manifestations in the United States to destroy the constitutional rule and the freedoms that we now enjoy and to impose Sharia over us.
Am I correct in understanding that one of these Muslim Brotherhood front organizations has also had responsibility for recruiting, training, and credentialing chaplains for our prison system?
Yes, absolutely. And so the same problem that we discussed about the military prevails with the prison system, that you have imams in both, and particularly in the prisons, actually, because that's been a very concerted effort to, you could say, to exploit the resentments and the alienation that the prisoners are already going to be feeling and to direct it into jihadist activity. We have the spectacle of these guys, imams, going into the prisons, avowedly attempting to recruit prisoners for jihad activity.
And what this has translated into, as I understand it, is a sort of incubator of a number of the plots that have been happily, with the exception of the Major Hassan attack at Fort Hood, intercepted by law enforcement. But I think, as is generally the rule of thumb in most of these cases, whether it's narco trafficking or alien smuggling or counterfeiting or other kinds of activities, what you actually intercept is probably just a fraction of what's going on. So is it fair to say that if this kind of recruitment by those who adhere to Sharia, working under the auspices of one or the other of the Muslim Brotherhood fronts, are in fact recruiting felons in our prison system, that we are likely to see more of the sorts of plots that are going to be attempted and perhaps perpetrated by those who are, as you said, given some divine justification for their animus towards the society that had put them away in the first place?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's really, I think, one of the main reasons why they recruit in the prisons, because they've got people who are already willing to be violent, already willing to take risks, already willing to go outside the law. and they can channel that and give it a divine justification and say, now you can do all these things and serve God at the same time. It's a very powerful presentation, and one that's clearly effective.
Yeah. There's one organization that I've heard of, and I'd love to have you, amplify on any of this, Robert. Jamaat al-Fukra, which has been described as a kind of halfway house for these felons and other convicts coming out of the prisons and being given further training and indoctrination in the ways of jihad by a Pakistani sheikh by the name of Jilani, as I understand it. Is this in fact a manifestation of the problem that we've been talking about this hour, and one that we should be particularly alive to?
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Jamaat al-Fukra is an extraordinarily dangerous group. Just to give you one example, Sheikh Jilani is the Islamic sheikh, the Islamic imam, who was, Daniel Pearl was on his way to interview when he was captured by members of Jamaat al-Fukra and beheaded. And this was, of course, a celebrated incident, a notorious incident, but it did not prevent Sheikh Jilani from continuing to operate in the United States, where he has numerous camps of Muslims in remote rural areas that where we have information that there's firearms training going on, weapons training going on, and clearly a stance that is set against that the United States, clearly disloyal to the United States Constitution and government, clearly dedicated to jihad activity and the imposition of Shariah, but it's gotten very little attention from law enforcement officials, probably because so much of our response to Islamic jihad activity is hamstrung by ignorance, by an unwillingness to, as we've discussed before, Frank, to acknowledge that there is more to this than connections to active terrorist groups, and also a fear that if you come down upon Muslims in the United States, then the Islamic advocacy groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations will start to charge you with bigotry and hatred and racism and so on, and they've been very effective in wielding that kind of charge to stymie law enforcement activity as well as media scrutiny.
Yeah, very, very important points, Robert, all of them. One of the things that is particularly alarming about how Sharia is being advanced is through the nonviolent form of jihad. The violent form, of course, all of us, particularly since 9/11, have had to reckon with a bit, and I think are, to varying degrees at least, cognizant of the danger it represents. What Robert Spencer has done is a tremendous public service, most especially in his wonderful book, Stealth Jihad, How Radical Islam is Subverting America Without Guns or Bombs, is to help illuminate the various ways in which these Muslim Brotherhood organizations, like the Council on American Islamic Relations, for example, the Islamic Society of North America, the Muslim Students Association, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and so on, are seeking stealthily to advance this very agenda for reasons that Robert said before the break, are aimed at our destruction, the destruction of our society. So, Robert Spencer, again, thank you for being with us today. Let's start with the political influence operations of these various Muslim Brotherhood entities. Where do you see that form of stealth jihad manifesting itself?
Well, Frank, really the primary groups that speak for Muslims in the United States are pretty much all connected to the Brotherhood. The Council on American Islamic Relations, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, the Islamic Society of North America, and so on. And yet they have a pretty much free pass from the mainstream media and are presented as moderate groups that reject terrorism. And certainly these groups don't have any connection to terrorism as such. but they do have a strong connection to Sharia and to the Sharia imperative to bring Sharia over to the West and to impose it ultimately upon the United States. And so these groups have been extraordinarily successful in presenting themselves as the spokesmen for Muslims in the United States, and as consequently as advocates for a group that they present as being oppressed, as being an afflicted minority group that is deserving of special consideration, and are able, on that basis, to manipulate the political process in the United States, because it's very profitable. It's very effective to be a victim class nowadays in the United States, and to claim special privileges on that basis. And of course, they also present themselves as being a group that has some numbers in the United States, although those numbers are ordinarily exaggerated, and consequently one that politicians would do well to court so that they can get their votes. And on the basis of both of these initiatives, the doubling of the victim status as an oppressed minority and their alleged voting clout, they are able to wield, and they do wield, extraordinary influence on the American political process. Council on American Islamic Relations and others have been able to have access to the highest levels of the United States government, and to meet with the president. I remember Ibrahim Hooper of the Council on American Islamic Relations boasting a few years back that he could call up the White House and George Bush or Colin Powell would say what he wanted them to say the next day. And, you know, that when you're talking about a Muslim Brotherhood organization, an organization that is vowed to impose Sharia here and destroy Western civilization from within, that's something that every free American, every free person ought to be very concerned about and be trying to reverse.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Robert Spencer, and unfortunately it's not stopped with the passing of the torch from George W. Bush's administration to that of Barack Obama. In fact, I think you would agree that if anything, it's gotten worse with placements of some of these operatives in high office, and certainly their influence expanding. Let's talk quickly about the form of jihad that these fellows are practicing that comes under a rubric we've called here at Secure Freedom Radio lawfare. Assaults on our liberties, in some cases using those liberties as the vehicle, as you said, through this victimhood status and so on. But talk to us about specifically the assault on freedom of speech, Robert Spencer.
Well, take, for example, the Barack Obama initiative at the United Nations, which is extraordinarily disquieting and has gotten very little attention. But the United Nations Human Rights Council every year has been the arena for an initiative against free speech, sponsored by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, which is 57 Muslim governments around the world, and is the largest voting bloc at the UN since the collapse of the communist bloc. And the Organization of the Islamic Conference has sponsored resolutions every year to criminalize, calling upon member states to criminalize the criticism of Islam, and characterizing the criticism of Islam even when it is referring to, when what is being referred to is anti-terror efforts to understand the motives and goals of Islamic jihadists. That is considered to be hate speech, to be Islamophobia, and is the subject of these attempts to criminalize it. Under the Bush administration, the United States always opposed these initiatives, but last summer, the Obama administration actually had the United States join with Egypt to co-sponsor one of these resolutions calling upon member states of the UN to criminalize what it called incitement to religious hatred, which is how Islamic jihadist and Islamic supremacist groups generally characterize any honest discussion of the elements of Islam that give rise to and that are used by Islamic jihadists that give rise to terror, I should say, and are used by Islamic jihadists to justify violence and supremacism and Sharia initiatives. And so the idea that the United States government and the President of the United States would now be on record at the UN favoring something that is directly opposed to the freedom of speech Well, that's very disquieting. That's more than disquieting. That is an extraordinary development, and it coincides perfectly with the efforts by Islamic advocacy groups in the U.S. to stigmatize and to marginalize those who speak out about Islamic Jihad activity in the U.S. and to rule it outside the bounds of polite or proper political discourse. It's all an attempt to make us mute and thus defenseless before the advancing jihad.
Yeah, it goes back to that point that General Keane made in the clip we played before the break. If we do not know what the threat looks like, we're certainly not going to be able to do anything about it. And Robert Spencer, you have been at the receiving end of a great deal of this calumny and of the effort to suppress your freedom of speech and your rendering in I think a way that is both accurate and non-polemical, though deeply obviously offensive to and contrary to the efforts of the Muslim Brotherhood as it seeks here in America to force us to submit, to force us to accommodate, to force us to change in such ways as to enable the steady, if salami-like, progression towards the achievement of their ultimate end state, which is, as you have pointed out, in their words, is the destruction of the United States and Western civilization from within by its own miserable hand. And I'm so delighted, Robert Spencer, to have you here with us as a guest again on Secure Freedom Radio. We're appreciative of your spending this time with us to really drill down on so many of these points. We look forward to having you back in the future for more of what we really need to know to secure our freedom in the face of Shariah and the threat that it poses. That's it for this installment of Secure Freedom Radio. I hope you found it as fascinating as I have, and that you'll tune in again tomorrow. Same time, same station. For all of us here at Secure Freedom Radio, this is Frank Gaffney.
From the nation's capital, SwissAmerica.com has presented Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney.